welcome everyone to the panel session, Race and Diversity in Educational Psychology, Charting the Way Forward. This session is being brought to you by the Division 15 Race and Diversity Committee. I am Jessica DeCuir-Gunby, a professor of educational psychology at NC State University and the chair of the committee. My fellow committee members are DeLeon Gray, Christy Bird, Ananya Matewos, Reverly Kumar, and Krista Lira. And this is our first official event as a committee. And we are so excited that you have joined us. This is the first of two conference sessions on race and diversity in educational psychology. The second session is tomorrow afternoon at 1:30 p.m. It will consist of small group discussions on various race-related topics. And so we are really hoping that you would join us then as well. So today you are really in for a treat. We have invited several amazing scholars to share their approaches to and experiences with addressing issues of race and diversity in educational psychology. We have Brendisha Tynes, Professor of Education and Psychology from the University of Southern California. Kane Zuccio, Professor of Educational Psychology at Fordham University. Francesca Lopez, Waterbury Chair in Equity Pedagogy and Professor of Education at Penn State University. And a semi-retired Paul Schutz, Professor of Practice at the University of Arizona. Our moderator for today is Marcus Johnson, Professor of Educational Psychology at Virginia Tech, and DeLeon Gray, Associate Professor of Educational Psychology at NC State University, will provide our closing statement. We will also have a Q&A segment, so please make sure to write all questions in the chat during the panel discussion and then at the end. And so now I will turn things over to our moderator and the panel. So Marcus, this is all yours.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. Wanted to just, in terms of setting the tone for this session, just want to say that some of the things I'm going to ask the panelists questions, but I'm going to oftentimes bring things back to a couple of themes that again, to set the tone for the session, which include the applicability of our panelists' work. What can be done to enhance people's scholarship at the present time, as well as where can we go forward for future pursuits. And so I'll begin actually with an overarching question and an introductory question, which is how have you used race and diversity in your work, and what have been some challenges? So again, I'll open this up to, for anybody to start, but to start off with, again, how have you used race and diversity in your work?
Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you all, and I really appreciate being on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. So thank you for the invitation. So for about 20 years now, I've used qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods to study the racial landscape that adolescents and emerging adults navigate in online spaces. And I've been particularly interested in online racial discrimination and how it might be associated with mental health and academic outcomes, as well as behavior. So my first study, just real quickly, my first study was on race-related discourse in teen chat rooms. And while I was collecting data, I would go into AOL chat rooms for about half-hour periods. And I noticed one day that there was a Mexican teen who was being attacked the whole hour. And she said in Spanish, "I don't like racists." And then she said, "I'm having heart palpitations." And so that made me think, you know, is online racial discrimination associated with mental health outcomes? But at the time, there were no measures, right? So I created the online victimization scale, which has subscales for individual racial discrimination and vicarious discrimination. More recently, I've started to try to understand how traumatic events online, like seeing these viral videos of police racial violence, or unarmed Black people being killed, how those experiences might be related to PTSD and depressive symptoms. And I'm right now doing a nationally representative longitudinal study to find out if critical digital literacy is a buffer in the association between these traumatic events and mental health outcomes.
So, hi everyone. My name is Kane Zuccio. I guess let me just first begin by saying that issues of race did not become central in my investigations until fairly recently. But I've been very much interested for a long time in issues of culture. I wasn't born in the United States. I was born in Japan, and I've always felt growing up here in the US that I've kind of been straddling both worlds. In fact, I even had to go to Japanese weekend school on Saturdays. And so that really was, the lens in which I saw the world. And when I got to grad school at Michigan, I remember thinking in Paul Pinchett's motivation class, a lot of the stuff spoke to me, but there was something that I was like, I'm not entirely sure if that really describes me. And, and so that's really when I became more interested in issues of culture and motivation. And in particular, I was interested in the experiences of Asian American students, particularly bicultural Asian American students like me, and trying to understand, how the situation, the environment could shift one's mindset to think more, quote unquote, American, whatever that means, or more, in line with one's Asian heritage cultures, and then since then I've really expanded to consider how generally we can design learning environments that are just supportive of students' motivation and learning in general. So in that sense, I right now I focus much more on teachers. Last year I served a stint as dean, and now I'm actually becoming much more interested in looking at things systemically and trying to understand the world, leaders and how we prepare educational leaders. And so, I could see myself focusing or shifting a little bit of my focus there. But ultimately, at my core, I just think every child, no matter what their background, their race, their identities, deserve a good education, and I'm committed to doing the kind of work that would allow for us to actualize such a world. There's a lot of work to be done, and in terms of challenges, I think that was the second part of the question. There are so many challenges because I think it's really hard to operationalize race. It's hard to operationalize culture. I think some of the tools that educational psychologists rely on, like quantitative methods, I value so much, but I think it really requires, in order for us not to sort of promote more of a deficit framing, we really need to think about issues of epistemology, axiology, ontology, things that I did not think of at all when I first started out doing this work. In that sense, I think I've really grown. I'm still learning too. I mean, I think that's another theme. If you ask me this question when I first started out, my designs of my studies were really different than I think what I'm thinking about now, and that's all part of the process. So it's exciting work in that regard.
That's been one of my concerns recently, and if I know people are sick of hearing me who are close enough to me that hear me say this all the time, is that variabilizing race is very problematic. And I think one of the things that remember, we're talking about a social construct. And I think one of the things when Jessica and I were putting together the EP article a few years ago that really made this stick is when we went through the years looking at the census. And in the beginning of the census, it was basically designed there. The only question was, are you Black or mulatto? So in other words, it was basically a binary. Now, if you take the last census, then now it's an amalgamation of, country, where you live, ethnic, and so if you just take, South American or Central American countries, if you're in Puerto Rico, that's not the same as if you're in Honduras, yet on a quantitative measure where we put race on there, that would fall into this Hispanic category. And we can do the same thing with, folks from Asia, different countries in Asia. Korea and Japan are not the same thing. So I think as a challenge for quantitative folks, I'm waiting for one of you youngsters to figure that out for me, because I can't quite get my head around it yet. So email me when you do, and I'll be happy to look at it.
So before I jump into the answer, to your question, Marcus, I was gonna say it's really amazing, Rindisha and Akani, to hear your backstory, and I wish there was more of a platform, because we read each other's work, but to know the why we landed doing the work is so cool. So I really loved hearing your background and what brought you into that. For me, I grew up on the border. I'm Latina, Mexican American. Spanish was my first language. I became a bilingual teacher in Texas. My background and my research really looks at identity and context and motivation in that sense. But this is important to why I do what I do now, because growing up on the border, it was not a salient identity. Everybody was like me. Liliana, I know you and I were in a very similar conversation yesterday. It wasn't salient for me. Everyone like me spoke two languages. It was not a big deal. We learned that California had passed this anti-bilingual law when I was a teacher, and it was shocking. And then I moved to Tucson, Arizona. And there I am raising two young boys. They are labeled English learners, and I learn about the policies. And this is the context in which I started my doctoral program. So for me, it was a very personal journey in terms of not understanding how policies can be enacted that are so harmful and not research-based. And so a lot of my early work, I had no choice but to include race. Like Latino identity is racialized, right? And so it's this idea of trying to give more evidence to practices. And so I looked at motivation across two different states that had different policies. And sure enough, study after study, I found that the more asset-based the policies were, the better the outcomes were for students, right? And that just led me to looking at classroom contexts and what teachers needed to know, to be effective as teachers for students of color. And so for me, it's just always been part of an identity, because it was just kind of so in my face when I got to Arizona that it became very clear navigating who I was. But that brings me to, also related to what you brought up, Paul, identity is one of these things that it depends on the context, what is brought out, what matters, what needs to be supported because of the different forces that are in that particular context. And so in terms of challenges, there are many. We're living one of those challenges now, I think, in the United States and globally with the anti-CRT policies going around, right? Where nowhere do we see any kind of evidence at all informing that. And so I think one of the big challenges is not only the changing metrics for examining, things that matter, but the political waves that kind of get in our way when we're trying to do the work that we're trying to do.
Thank you for that, Francesca. And Paul, I know that you had already commented, but could you actually say a little bit about your journey into this and how you use race and diversity in your work?
Yeah, that's, it's long. I'm old, so it's but yeah, I think basically, it started out as when I was a philosophy student. You know, I'm from a one stoplight town in Minnesota, and there are diversity is not, it's not what's there. And so at college, though, I started doing things related to, I had a philosophy instructor who had a lot of impact on me. And he had us reading systems theory early on. I mean, I've read von Bertalanffy, Weiss and Kessler, Lamarck theory of, he was interested in those things back then. And that sort of started my journey. But I think where I mostly began using it is in my classes, where I started to put articles from various people into my classes. And so that was one of the places where it come in. And then, you know, through personal relationships and things like that, it became more real. For as a, you know, old straight white male, you know, I discover, you know, new privileges that I have every day. And so there's that journey as well. But yeah, so I use it in basically, it's not a use thing no more. Use it means that you could also put it down. I'm going to use it today and I'm not going to use it. I didn't use it this afternoon. I used it this morning. It becomes a way of looking at the world. And I think that's one of the things by, you know, when you think about folks who are embedded in critical race theory, that's how they look at the world. It's not something. And so at this point, it's just a matter, this is how I look at things. And so that's where I'm at this point.
Well, it actually brings me to my next question in terms of so
Hey, Marcus,
it's a two-part question. Yeah.
Can I just say real quick what I think some of the challenges have been?
I'll return back to that.
You will? Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah. Wanted to ask a two-part question. What are some of your theoretical frameworks that you utilize to study race and diversity? But in addition to that, how can it be applied, or even in your work and your findings? How can your findings be applied, or the theoretical frameworks be applied? So if you can all comment on that.
Francesca, do you want to start? I don't.
Yeah, well, mine's brief. So the theoretical framework, I'll just use one from a recent study. I think when we look at teacher expectations, right, and the different frameworks, meta-analyses that we know, right, teacher knowledge informs their behaviors, which we know then students internalize, which leads to outcomes, right? That in and of itself was fine, but it doesn't consider race. So Paul and Jessica's, what I'm calling seminal, your paper, right, an educational psychologist with race framing and race reimaging, was precisely, I mean, the moment that came out, I felt like I had it, right? I was able to then take something and actually apply it in a way that could be useful. And I think it's given me the tools, right, to be able to name how we can take the different frameworks in educational psychology that have for so long ignored race that are needed, right? So that's all I'll say about that. Go ahead, Akani.
So, you know, if you look at my work, the two primary theoretical frameworks that I've always relied on, and I still rely on, is the research on motivation, as well as the research on self-regulated learning. And those are two, you know, they're I don't know if basic's the right word, but they're foundational theoretical frameworks. Obviously, I've done more work in achievement goal theory than some of the other motivational theories, but I just, you know, I believe, and I think we have empirical evidence to suggest that everybody, when they feel autonomous, when they feel competent, when they feel a sense of belonging and that what they're doing is meaningful to them, we flourish. I think what I've learned is that not everyone, because of the way our schools are structured, feels that. And so in that sense, the research on motivation will continue to be sort of my guiding light. And similarly with self-regulated learning theory, I really have grown to appreciate how to get students to take ownership of their learning, and some of the principles of this idea of control and regulation, I think is really critical to understanding issues of equity. And so I will always return to those. That being said, like Francesca, I will also, they don't always talk about issues of power and hegemony and the fact that we all are ethnocentric, and which I've learned from, yes, Paul and Jessica's work and some of the the work that the other panelists have done. And I think that's really important. I also think that it's important for us to consider other disciplines. So right now, it's funny that Paul mentions systems theory, but I'm very much intrigued by the work in sociology around that. I am very much influenced by a lot of the work that's coming out in cultural psychology and cross-cultural psychology in general, because I do think that there is, there are things to learn there in terms of, universality versus, culture-specific processes. So, those are sort of the major frameworks that I often rely on.
So I've used Garcia, Cole et al.'s integrative model of developmental competencies. I've used Quintana's work on the impact of racism on children. But because we have foreign powers and white supremacists basically targeting Black people, Latinos, conservative whites online, it's sort of demanded that I take a more critical perspective in my work. And so I'm using critical race theory now. And actually, I came up with, my team and I, we now use a framework called critical race digital literacy, where we are hoping to help kids to place some of the messages that they're getting in historical context, and to really think critically about some of the misinformation, the disinformation campaigns that are geared toward voter suppression and a whole host of issues, including, COVID vaccines. So critical race theory is informing a lot of what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, in addition to sort of a systems theory approach, and one of the things that we don't often think about, but it's one of the ways I think where you can tie it into where most EdPsych might be is, Grafenbrenner's theories related to, the chronosystem and the macro system are ideally situated, if you talk about those, to talk about context, and which is key elements to that. So I think that's another one you might not think about right off the top, but because we generally focus on the microsystem, mesosystem as psychologists, because that's where we tend to focus. But when you bring those other things in, it gives you some language to talk about that as well, in addition to critical race theory and others.
I agree, Paul. And I'm not a scholar of Bronfenbrenner's work, but I've grown to appreciate it so much more over time. And the not just the chronosystem part, but recently I've become intrigued by I forget what word he used, but he talked about it toward the end as being like a bioecological. So he emphasized also the biological component. And I do think that, if anything, COVID should teach us something on climate change. We can't ignore biology, and this interaction between human nature and culture, I think, is an important one.
Wanted to return back to my question about some of the challenges that all of you have faced, and I'm like, in our work in academia, there are small challenges and grander, I would say, geopolitical challenges, with critical race theory being a hot topic right now, or being very present in our daily news cycle. What are some of the challenges that you have all faced? Again, big or small, and what can be done to overcome those challenges if somebody wants to jump into this work or get into this line of work of concerning issues of race and diversity. So challenges and any advice in terms of overcoming the challenges. And Brindisha, I know that you wanted to return to that question as well.
Yeah, so a major challenge first is that our field has been reluctant to publish research that focuses on race. And we have colleagues who demean our work when we have race as a central focus. And so that's probably the biggest challenge. But with respect to critical race theory, I'm creating an app right now called Critmatic that teaches kids digital literacy skills. And essentially, we won't be able to do any sort of studies of the app in places where they banned CRT, right? So that's a huge challenge. Luckily, more recently, funders have sort of got on the bandwagon, and we see, like, essentially the topic that I study is probably one of the most important topics of our time. And so I think people are coming around and really embracing the work that I do, and other scholars who use critical race theory or racial theories broadly to inform the work that they do. So very excited about that. The other question was, what can people do to address the challenges? One thing I think is really important is that people should train themselves, because we aren't training our graduate students to think about race, and so people should be sure to come up with a program of their own. I had to basically take courses for 7 years to piece together a program that would allow me to study race in a systematic way. And so once we have more of our graduate students who are trained to think about race, then that will ultimately change the field, and we'll have more people publishing on these issues, and really will be more relevant as a field if we could do that.
Excellent point. Thank you. And I know Francesca wanted to chime in here.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on one of, well, many challenges. And I think, Brindisha, what you just mentioned about all the courses, and Akani, you had mentioned, like, you're still learning. I think that is central to the issue of including race, right, in the study within an educational psychology kind of framework. One of the challenges I learned about, because trained as an educational psychologist, I too had to do a lot of learning outside of what is typically published in EdPsych. And I learned very quickly, sometimes because of the journals where I was submitting my work, corrections to my language, corrections to things that, the way I was presenting information. And, I just want to warn us, right, that in the academy, we have a lot of terms and they change. And especially outside of EdPsych, it seems, like in my own work, right, it went from LEP, which was limited English proficient, to ELL, which was English language learner, to emergent bilingual. And now that's problematized because in California, that means they are never proficient, right? And so these are terms that are constantly changing. The same is true for BIPOC, right? So it suddenly became part of the lexicon. And recently there was a paper kind of saying, say what you mean. And so when we're talking about issues of race, I noticed in the chat, there was some discussion about not using race because of the issues. And I just want to pass on warnings that I was given. Some people who work in this field outside of EdPsych warn that when we focus on culture, and that's all we focus on, we can have like a color evasive stance to things. Because what do we mean by culture, right? What do we mean by Black culture? What does that mean? And to whom? Who is the person doing the research asking that question? I've also been told that it's a very slippery slope. I, for example, do research in classrooms. If I say culture to teachers and they think by hanging a piñata in the classroom, they're being relevant, no, right? It's something totally different. And I just want to remind us, right? So Sesame Workshop did a study with children ages 6 to 11 and their parents, and the children, 86% race was on their mind. And more than half had racism as one of the things that was really worrying them. So if young children know this, like, I don't think we should shy away from these issues, and we need to say what we mean, and be wary. And I'm not saying that in the conversation, it was that people use euphemisms. We just have to step back and ask, what do we mean by culture? And is it a slippery slope to a deficit view? Because it's different than something else, right? It was a lesson I learned the hard way with, the famous reviewer number 2. So I want to pass on that knowledge. We want to be very vigilant and say what we mean. And to that, it kind of jumps into a question you have for us later, but reading outside our field, I think, is absolutely vital, because other people have been doing this for decades and they do it very well. And so being able to adopt some of that in our own framing and writing and the way we explain things, I think, is really, really important.
And thank you for that. I want to be mindful of our time, and just wanted to wrap up things with my last question, and actually going off of what Francesca had just recommended in terms of advice in terms of reading outside of educational psychology. But my last question is, where do we go as a discipline in educational psychology? Not only should, like Francesca's recommendation of reading outside of EdPsych, but I'm like, what else can we do as a field to advance our studies, advance our pursuits to improve issues of race and diversity?
Well, I think it's really important for scholars who are kind of the gatekeepers to have some humility. And I think I've encountered different types of scholars. So there's like the scholars who demean work on race, and then there are people who, sometimes these are the same people, but there are people who essentially they see themselves as leaders, in racial equity, and see their work as contributing to work on race when it's actually not. And so I would hope that we would use this moment first to do some self exploration, self-reflection on, your own training and what you need to do to get to a point where you can collaborate with other people on studies that include race and diversity issues, or you could, ultimately down the road lead your own studies. But for sure, it starts with, self-reflection and humility about where we are as a field.
I totally agree, Natasha. And I would say, adding to what you said, I think it's important for us to do that self-examination, but collectively as a field for us to do our examination of the blind spots our discipline has. I love psychology. I'm so proud to be a psychologist. I'm so proud to be an educational psychologist, but we got some blind spots. And so, I teach statistics. I'm going to be teaching statistics in a couple of weeks. And I started reading this book, Indigenous Statistics. Sorry, you can't see. I'll put it in the chat, by Walter and Anderson. And they talk about, oftentimes we talk about quant's bad if you're doing race related work, and qual's the way you should go. But their point is actually that it's not the method, the method. Well, what did they say? I wrote it down because I knew I was going to say it wrong. They talk about methodologies, not methods injure. And methodologies, they talk about it being sort of, understanding your social position, understanding your definition of what we know, like whose voices we're prioritizing, understanding why we're interested in a topic. I know why I study what I do. It's because of my own experiences. And what is reality? What does it mean to actually be? I think these are some of the tensions that I see in our field. I think come down to, it sounds philosophical, but I think we would love to see conversations among us, to that end, because I think if you get to the root of it, that's where, some of the headbutting comes in. So anyway.
So I think I agree with everything that's been said so far. And when I saw that question, my immediate reaction was like, it all depends on where the field wants to go, right? Do we want to be a field that is for the greater good? Or do we want to continue to replicate inequities? And there's a choice to be made. And I don't mean that hyperbolically, right? I think that if we look at the history of EdPsych, if we look at some of the key people in EdPsych, it's a very problematic history that we have to contend with, right? And I think, it's so interesting because in Paul and Jessica's paper where they talk about how often or how not often race is actually discussed in EdPsych, I personally found not a good spot because of everything that's already been mentioned. My work was not seen or considered EdPsych by those journals. So I found homes elsewhere. I simply did. Division G became from AERA became more of a home than Division C. That's not so true anymore because the field has changed. But I do think identity-wise, we have to think whose voices matter and what do we want learning and motivation to inform? And that should inform the field, right? Because, and like you said, Akani, it's not necessarily that it's quantitative, there's crit quant. And so do we look at, methods as a way to harm more and continue to see people as deficits? Or do we see where the problems are systemically that we need to address? So that's a very important question. And I think it will determine the future of who are members, of Division 15 and how we inform the learning that goes on in school. So very important question.
And I also appreciate what Radisha mentioned earlier about, informing and educating our graduate students who are going to be coming into, they're going to be the future of this field. So thank you for that. Paul, did you want to comment before I wrap things up?
Marcus, I was wondering if I could add something. I think one thing we need to go is that we cannot be afraid to address policy issues in EdPsych. We tend to run away from that and not address it at all. We have this whole anti-CRT thing going on. It's not really CRT. It really is anything that has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And pretty soon they're trying to legislate issues of race away from schools. They're trying to make it so teachers, like in Tennessee, can't even talk about race or racism without, or sexism without even being fined. In Texas, I mean, they have a whole laundry list of terms and issues that teachers can't talk about. So really what they're trying to do is make it so it's going to be illegal for us to teach, teachers to teach about issues of race and diversity. So we cannot be afraid to go out there and talk about how important it is for our teachers to teach about issues of race and diversity, and for students to learn about race and diversity. We cannot sit on the sidelines. We have to do issues. We have to get into the policy debate.
And thank you. And actually, really quick before I turn things over to Leon, just wanted to put a quick plug in that we will have a new journal coming out on EdSite and policy. And Francesca, if I can actually put you on the spot, did you want to say anything about the journal?
Yes. So Sharon Nichols is the lead, right? And I'll be her co-editor in this endeavor. And, you know, very briefly, she and I both independently have always had a lot of huge policy interests. And she has been working on this for quite some time, quite some time. And so this is really her vision that's finally come to fruition. And we're in the midst of all this. It will take some time to find the home and everything, but we are getting a lot of green lights from APA as we move forward, and we are so very excited because for the longest time, I mean, we do research as researchers to inform policy, right? We don't just want it sitting in a journal. And so the vision is to make not only this journal specific to policy, but to also have a component that is completely accessible to people who need it, hopefully, you know, without the paywall, so that they have access to that information. So if people are working on papers down the road, there will be a new home to consider for policy relevant work.
Thank you. And Leon, I'll turn things over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marcus, for sharing the platform. And I really appreciate the comments made by everyone today. One thing that stuck out to me the most that I want to double click on is this idea that there is a leaky pipeline of equity-focused scholars in educational psychology. As I think about what we're talking about today, I also think about strategy for how we can continue to build. We have 146 participants on this Zoom right now, which is huge and major for people who might have been in sessions where, you know, they might have struggled to even get a session, you know, at a conference that focused on this topic a decade ago. And so, you know, I'm reminded of that, you know, but also want to double click on some of the points that were made around being intentional in this work to make sure that future scholars can engage in this work and they have somewhat of a roadmap. So I'm going to pose a question to the group, but first, I want to double back to a few comments that were made. Paul mentioned this idea that variabilizing race is very problematic. So for graduate students who, you know, is where a lot of our diversity is in educational psychology, he challenges folks to think about ways of studying race, you know, better in quantitative methods. One paper for doing so is this paper by Janet Helms, 2005 in American Psychologist. It's on the meaning of race in psychology and how to change it. So that may be a good starting point for those who choose to take Paul up on his challenge. Akani mentioned this idea of focusing, letting her work evolve and letting it go through evolutions. And this is a helpful reminder for us to be flexible in our research agendas, give ourselves some grace, and look forward to ways of doing things better and improving the pipeline for those behind us. There's also this idea of a personal journey, which Francesca and Paul both mentioned. You know, so there are ways of being and knowing that guide our work, that guide our outlooks on life. And, you know, there are also past experiences, though, that as graduate students, we sometimes have been taught to forget, that have been silenced, distorted, and forgotten. So we need to remember put these things back together for ourselves, because these will be the sources of information that we can use to make our work more equitable in the future. And Radisha, she mentioned this idea of, just work that's a bit more broader than what educational psychologists typically focus on. So, we, can also ask questions that focus on our broader social impact and which could make us relevant to fields outside of educational psychology. And so this idea was also brought up about putting pieces together, putting a program of research together. And so my question to the group is this: you've all had to do this in some way over the course of your career, and you may still be doing so. But if a scholar is just starting out, they're in graduate school, and they're trying to figure out how to navigate this environment, and they don't have access to you at their institution, can you give us some practicals in terms of how you might piece together your program of research? Is it coming from just reading? What do you read? What classes are you taking? What music are you listening to? How do you spend your time? Where do you go for that inspiration, that creativity, that reminder of what you talked about in your personal statement in the first place, and letting that be a guide for your work as you navigate? So panelists, would you like to chime in on that question?
I'll just, some of the books that were most impactful to me were not from Ed Psych. And so I'm going to throw it is reading. A lot of it was from reading and living. I mean, I was on the border. Angela Valenzuela's Subtractive Schooling, I Am My Language by Norma Gonzalez, The Latino Education Problem by Patricia Gándara and Frances Contreras. I have a long list. If anybody's ever interested, I am happy to share it with you. I read as much as I can outside of Ed Psych, and it enriches what we do, right, when we understand other perspectives. So that's my 2 cents.
And I would add, if you don't have those resources available in your campus to, take advantages of conferences. I mean, many of you talked about how you intentionally joined Division G or some of the other, I don't know, I seek out these days conferences or sessions that would help me, push my thinking. So for me, sessions around critical race theory are top of mind recently, but I didn't do that as a graduate student. I wish I did, which is why my evolution has been slower than I perhaps would like it to have been. But I think those are important opportunities, and I would say just reach out. Email me, or or hopefully we could have some conversations offline too, because I learn from them as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's an easy path. You need to read and then read some more. And also something Dion talked about in the last session is you need to have a level of curiosity and interest to solve and think about these problems to help you carry it through. But it's not magic. I've been reading things related to this since 1971, and I don't necessarily have that many answers. And those answers are probably changed several times since then. It's work. This is a business or a career, a profession that involves a lot of reading, thinking, and talking with other people and writing and things like that. So that's how you get there, wherever there is.
Even the Rat Was White by Guthrie is a great starting place. It's not specifically about, it includes some ed psych, not a chapter, but like sections. But I would definitely start there and, sort of helping people to understand psychology, the history of psychology, and how problematic it's been. And then there's a whole, for people who are interested in online experiences, people can email me and I can give them lists of how online experiences might be associated with academic outcomes.
I do want to say one quick thing. I would, race is important, but I also think we need more studies understanding white culture. And, you know, I don't see as much emphasis on that. And for me, I think that understanding that could also help us move the needle a little bit more too.
And Leon, I would say go back to the old original articles. I was interested in racial identity. I started reading the Kenneth and Mamie Clark articles, and I even read the articles before the Kenneth and Mamie Clark. I want to say Horowitz. I'm talking about 1930s, 1928s. I mean, I went way back because I think you find so much information reading those really old foundational pieces as well. So go back as far as you can go back.
Thank you for that. Now that we've touched on some things that would help scholars at the beginning phases of that journey, you know, some folks who are next level or ready for that next level might want some ideas of, you know, ways that they can, you know, be engaged as well. You know, our field is very diverse in terms of where folks are along their equity focused journey in their research. So, you know, at the more advanced levels, when we think about what is advanced, you know, are there advanced questions that you're thinking about, maybe in terms of your research, but more broadly in terms of, you know, maybe how to get the work out, the development of tools and, you know, questioning assumptions of your previous work, maybe, you know, having conversations and guiding policy decisions and decisions of practitioners. You know, what are your current ways that you're challenging yourself to dig deeper in the moment?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but I think I tried to the best of my ability to be open-minded and humble, and to sort of like not assume that I know everything. And so that to me is challenging enough. And, you know, this is why I do seek, you know, reading outside of ed psych. And I think I would love for educational psychology to also, you know, think about those issues. And you know, we have contributed a lot to our understanding of learning and teaching, but I think we have also harmed, you know, and I think we need to grapple with that. And that's what I've been focusing in on a more practical day-to-day thing. You know, I now think about, okay, how do I change the way I teach, what I teach, how I mentor, you know, the conversations I have with my students. Those are things that I tried to do, which perhaps I didn't do as intentionally as you know, until now.
And as others chime in to respond, I want to pose a question to the audience. You know, feel free to give us the receipts. While folks are responding to this last question, put some takeaways in the chat for you. Type in the chat the thing that you're taking away the most from the session that you want to continue to reflect on and think about as we wrap up. But I'll pose it back to the scholars to hear more about how you're challenging yourselves.
I'm really trying to think deeply about designing learning environments for Black kids, and environments that center their humanity. And so I'm actually working on a chapter right now, and a framework that I hope to share soon, that will help us to think in broader ways and in different ways about how to ensure that the spaces we design for Black kids center their genius and their innovation. And so, yeah, I will be able to say more soon, but that's what I'm grappling with right now.
Let me throw in two things. One, and I'm able to do this, so don't feel like you need to do this. but I try to get on every search committee at the university I'm at that I can. And the reason I do that is so I can be in the room. Sanja has drilled into me, it's important to know who's in the room and to be in the room. And so when those discussions are going on, if you're in the room, then you can affect change. If you're not in that room, now again, some of you are doing 120% of the work you need. So don't add things, delete something else. But I find that search committees are really important. And then the other thing I try to do is to seek out graduate students of color as often as I can to try to help them and think about what they're doing.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think it's super important. I totally agree, but promotion and tenure committees, they are so very critical. Yeah, so if we can be in those spaces to push back against some of the traditional narratives we tend to hear about race, work that centers race, I say yes to all of those for that very same reasons Paul brought up.
Yeah, and once you get tenure, try to change those policies.
Well, thank you so much, panelists, for joining us today. We'll make use of this chat. We'll copy and paste the chat out of here, and we'll continue to connect. Let this not be the last time we connect about this topic. Looking forward to AERA 2022, and see you soon.